These days, we expect schools to do all kinds of things that have nothing to do with reading, writing, and arithmetic. Schools are hubs for dental and medical care. They serve a hot breakfast to kids who might not otherwise eat. And they serve entire families through adult education classes and family counseling. Randi Weingarten is president of the American Federation of Teachers. She grapples every day with the evolving relationship between our schools and our communities. She's here to talk about that with the Atlantic's Washington editor-at-large, Steve Clemons.
So I see you're pink, not yellow and blue. I've kind of got a mix of all of the colors here. I don't know. So I can get angry or low energy or high energy, so we're going to fix this thing. Randi, thank you very much for joining us this morning. I guess I would start out with this broad question, which our last speaker was talking about, the social and emotional needs of children. I don't know that element of the work much, but it seems that when you look at the debate that is undergoing throughout the country right now on testing, you've been advocating something similar, sort of a bigger picture. Tell us about that.
Absolutely, but now I think we should all be wearing mood rings, frankly. Remember those old mood rings? And you could see, what your mood was.
That was the original
when
wearable.
Harold Levy was chancellor.
The original Fitbit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When he was chancellor in the New York City school system, I actually used to wear one every day. But seriously.
What color was it?
It depended on the moment. But in all seriousness, I do think that we don't think enough about social emotional learning and our own social emotional reactions. And so one of these, sometimes people talk about that as the soft skills as opposed to the essential skills. So I think you need to do, frankly, 4 things. I think we need to, and I talk about it sometimes in terms of schools. You make every single public school a place where parents want to send their kids, where kids are engaged, and where educators want to work. Because you have to think about all 3 ecosystems. You have to think about parents and their involvement, maybe in terms of family involvement. You have to think about kids and how we engage kids, not as where we want them to be at the end, but where they are right now and how to do that. And that includes instructional strategies and all of this emotional, social learning. In fact, I talk about how we need to engage the whole child and stop being fixated on tests and start being fixated on children. And the last thing is, you actually have to think about teachers' capacity building. And how, because none of us, when we start teaching, are prepared for it. I don't care which school we're in, but particularly if we're in underserved districts or underserved schools, we are not prepared for everything that's going to be thrown at us. And we need to actually be prepared on a social, emotional, and instructional way, because you need to create an environment that is welcoming and where kids feel like they can be their whole selves.
Right, but we have so many schools today that parents aren't involved in, that kids don't want to go to, and teachers are burning out quickly. And that's a big chunk of the American educational system, as I understand it. How did we get there?
Well, thank you for asking. I think we do actually need a reset right now. I think the problem is, in the last 10 to 20 years, we tried to take the easy route and say that there was a direct correlation and essentially almost a one-to-one correlation between the effort of a school teacher and the success of a student, and as displayed by that student's math or English test. And even the economists right now, Chetty and Hanashek and others, are saying that even when we get it right, individual teachers may account for about a 1 to 14% variance in students' test scores. So what this has done is it has taken everybody else off the hook, but more importantly, it has led to this kind of no excuse strategy, or, a teacher, if the student's test scores are great, the teacher is great. If a student's test scores are terrible, the teacher is terrible. And the research just doesn't show that. But what it's done is it's stopped us from going through and dealing with all these other issues, including engagement, including resilience, including the fact that half our kids in public schools are poor right now, including the fact that there's a big issue about segregation and lack of integration and lack of social mobility and income inequality and how that all affects things. So I think what we've tried to do is, instead of continuing this really mind-numbing debate on whose fault this is, let's actually start thinking about what the ingredients of great schools are. And the ingredients of great schools are a welcoming, safe environment, like the last speaker talked about, where teachers have the knowledge to actually meet the needs of individual kids, where you wrap services around schools like the community schools, where you're not just wrapping services around schools for kids, but for families, and where you really engage kids, like in this new area of career tech ed.
So you mentioned career tech ed. I just read an article that you wrote today in the Des Moines Register, sort of at this moment, this political season, what every candidate should be about. And you raise this issue of career tech ed and community schools, and the importance of community schools. And you're a major force and face in the American education movement, a controversial one. And I'm interested in whether you see...
How's everybody's mood ring right now?
The CTE and community school initiatives, how do you, one, tell us a little bit about them, but how do you see both your foes and other parts of the educational establishment coming in? Is that space that people can commingle interests, or does it just continue the wars?
Both those spaces are places where people can commingle interests if they so choose. As you know, like we've done in McDowell County, West Virginia, where we run this public-private partnership to try to turn around the fortunes.
Maybe tell McDowell. McDowell County, West Virginia is one of the poorest counties in the country.
It's about the 8th poorest county in the country. And we got involved because Joe and Gail Manchin kind of convinced us to get involved, because there had been 10 years where the state controlled the school system. The school system didn't move. We saw instead just less employment, more drug use, and less and really negative outcomes for kids, because kids felt so despairing. So the goal was, how do you create a public-private partnership that not only focused on instruction, but focused on the social well-being of kids and their families, and got jobs into the county? And so that, and what's happened is, in 3 years, the tech companies have actually broadbanded the county. We're starting to see a very slow influx of jobs. We have a community school around one of the 8 schools, and just this week, 18 kids from McDowell spent the week with us in Washington, job shadowing, going to colleges, and you see what happens when you open kids' minds and they start seeing, even if they go back to McDowell, that there's real opportunity. So that's kind of the notion of community schools, and we have 150 partners. CTE is even better because, and I'm sure that in this summit you're going to talk about the job mismatch. If we actually help kids get the skills that they need in high school and community college, they can go directly into middle-class jobs. And what CTE does, it's not, our grandfather's old vocational ed.
Humanize CTE for a minute. Tell what does that really mean?
So
wood shop?
Not really.
Yeah.
It means things like at Slauson Tech School in Los Angeles. Right. Kids are learning how to be electrical linemen. And you see, and I saw John Dacey here, he made sure that school stayed there and stayed intact when they were about to close it. You have like 30 poles in the yard, and kids are learning both the physicality of climbing up those poles and all the electrical work. The Harbor School in New York City, kids are learning how to actually not just harvest oysters, but how to do the work they need to be longshoremen and to be shipmates in terms of that. A school like a school in mid-Manhattan has a tilapia farm in the basement and an herb garden on the roof. Wow. In terms of how do you help kids directly go into the hospitality area. Take tech. We had just this week, when we announced this 5-city compact for career tech ed between New York City, Peoria, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, and Miami-Dade. We had representatives from Apple, from Adobe, from others, because they understand, like we do, that if we can help kids get the certification so that they not only know how to code, but can go right into a job like P-Tech understands, they're going to have a middle-class job and they're going to have options.
So,
and this is the greatest thing about CTE programs, good CTE programs. It gives kids real options. 90% of kids that go to high-quality CTE programs graduate from high school, and 70% of them go to college. So in some ways, no pun intended, the world is their oyster.
So do you have the teachers in the system today in your union who can provide those pathways? Because I remember you and I talked once about coding and, say, computer skills, and you shared the shocking data point that you had one computer scientist in all of the New York City public school systems.
So this is computer
It sounds
science.
like a mismatch. There's a mismatch not just between graduates and jobs, but a mismatch between aspirations in the schools and teachers you've got.
So one of the reasons that we started as a 5-city up program, and IBM has understood this with P-Tech as well, is that you start thinking about how you back map from what the skills and knowledge kids need, including the social and emotional skills they need and the resilience they need. You back map from that to the beginning of high school or to middle school. That's why, for example, in San Francisco, their program under the 5-City Compact is teaching kids computer skills in middle school. And under New York State law, in the certification areas, computer science and coding is not one of the certification areas. So what we're doing, what New York City is doing, is they have something called the NICE program. And what they're trying to do is create certifications for teachers so that teachers feel very equipped to teaching these fields, and Apple and Adobe is helping us with that. And then the key is that kids leave high school or community college with not just a degree, but a certification. The certification, it's what's monetizable, what's marketable.
Right. I spent a little bit of time this weekend reading about the community school up in Morningside Heights and the whole experience there. And it is a really, Morningside Heights is in New York, and there's a community school there. And one of the things that they found is that there was a higher no-show rate, or truancy rate, I guess, on Mondays. And in part, when they did interviews, they found that parents were ashamed to send their kids to school because they hadn't been able to wash the child. I mean, it was sort of an interesting pathway into a different world that many people here aren't used to. And and I guess the question I have is, tell us a little bit about that in just a few minutes, but when you're trying to deal with people's life issues and help wrap that around, it's hard to imagine, in the long run, excellence so much charts with opportunity today. How do you get from that reality of solving the laundry problem, which I think you've done in Morningside Heights, to excellent outcomes, so that when people think of you and your operation, they're not thinking of mediocrity, they're thinking of excellence? How do you get there?
So first, let me just also say, we haven't talked about how you attract, retain, support teachers in schools.
Right.
And we have to deal with those pipeline issues. And also, bottom line, if somebody can't teach, they shouldn't be there. And I know we have to deal with that. But let me use an experience I had in teaching high school in Brooklyn. One day, I was teaching, I think it was one of my street law classes. I don't quite remember exactly what class it is. And one of my kids came in, and she was just totally vacuous. Just her eyes were, she couldn't look at me, she couldn't look at the other kids, her shoulders were slumped down. You knew something was wrong. You didn't have to be a psychologist to know something was wrong. She trusted me enough, and the kids in my class trusted me enough. I broke every single rule. Sorry, I could have been fired that day. I broke every rule. I'm on the 4th floor. I leave my kids alone. I go from my room to, thank God, we still had guidance counselors and a social worker and psychologist in the school because of a big school. I hugged her as I was bringing her to these folks. And what we found out, and I stayed there until I found somebody who she could be in charge of her. Her father had died the day before. we think under pretty unfortunate circumstances. I don't want to
Yeah.
disclose more. The fact she came to school, the fact she saw that school was a place that she could get help, that's what we're trying to do. I think Hillary Clinton is actually doing some really good work right now by talking about her mom and the fact that her mom was abandoned and she was hungry, and that her first grade teacher, without embarrassing her, found a way to give her mom food.
Life stories.
That's what the community school in Euler in Cincinnati does. It gives every single kid a bag of food for the weekend. The school in Morningside Heights, we have a laundromat there.
Right.
And so part of what they're trying to do is make it fun, so that there's no embarrassment, there's no stigma. But if we don't actually meet the needs of our kids where they are, and meet the needs of families so that families see schools, public schools, as the center of their community, then we're not going to solve this.
So lightning round, we're going to take one question because we're just right at the end. But so real fast answer, can charters be your friends in that?
Yes, if we go back to the notion that Al Shanker had when he started charters, which was that we should not be a competitive environment, but we should figure out how to work together and how to do things together. And frankly, that's what the charter school that we started in New York City in South Bronx
Right.
does. But there's too much competition and not enough collaboration and working together.
So I talked to our editor-in-chief, my pal James Bennett, who's coming up here, and I said, what question would you ask? He says, what's the right mix between charters and other traditional public schools? He says, in New Orleans, you've got about 100% charter schools, D.C. about half and half, New York less charter schools than the overall. What is the right mix in relationship as you see it?
I think that's a really false choice and a false question.
Okay,
Sorry,
that was James Bennett's question.
But because the bottom line is,
Sorry,
90% of kids
Yeah.
in America still go to public schools.
Right.
We need
How
to
many?
make 90%. We need to make every public school a place where parents want to send their kids. And if there's charters that are going to actually help us do that, that would be great. But it shouldn't be a competitive situation.
Highest hand, quick, right here.
My name is Martin Apple. I want to ask, I'm from the Council of Scientific Society Presidents. If you could re-envision the AFT for its next 20 years, would it focus more on professional development as a year-round, 24/7, lifelong event for teachers? Would it focus on finding the 50 types of schools that would be the match for all of the kids and then figure out how to put them in so they matched? What would be the system?
What would be a great question?
That's a
20
great
years
question.
from now.
Well, first, I would actually focus on the fact that our unions should not be based upon an industrial model, but we should be based upon a craft model, which goes to your question, sir, which is that you have to focus on both when you're talking about supporting, recruiting, supporting, and retaining teachers. You have to focus on three things. You have to focus on professional development and delivering it like the trades do to make sure that you have the highest quality, but you also have to focus on the tools and conditions that teachers have in schools, and you have to focus on making sure that this is a middle-class profession. So you need to do all of those things.
Just to wrap up, it seems to me you're kind of like the center of a Wizard of Oz. That you basically sit behind the screen, and through your networks, you can basically take the beat of the country, the heartbeat of what's happening in schools around the country. And along the lines of this last question, it seems to me, can't data down the road help you see who's performing in extraordinary circumstances, who's producing excellence either in Morningside or McDowell, West Virginia, and doing something within that realm so that it can become replicable and scalable. Oftentimes, because we hear about these silver bullet moments of someone who did something extraordinary, does data become your friend? And are your union members willing to live in a world where you're able to kind of zero in on what's working and, more importantly, what's not? But we need to do it in 3 seconds. 4 seconds.
Data is the beginning of the inquiry, not the end.
Right.
And right now, it's used, first off, not all data is used, But right now, very, very crude data is used, and it's used at the end as a hammer as opposed to the beginning of the inquiry. That's why, even with charters, what we've said is, let's see charters actually having to play on the same playing field as the rest of the public schools. And what you're seeing in a lot of places is that charters don't want to do that.
Ladies and gentlemen, Randi Weingarten, President of the American Federation of Teachers. Thank you, Randi. Thank you.